Judge Thomas Barrett's morning begins like any other in Nashville's Municipal Court, room 302. His black robe, freshly pressed by his housekeeper Maria, swishes authoritatively as he emerges from his chambers at precisely 9:00 a.m. The familiar scent of lemon-scented cleaner and decades-old wooden benches fills his nostrils, a smell he's breathed for 15 years on this bench, though lately it's been giving him a headache. All rise. The bailiff's voice booms across the crowded courtroom. The usual Monday morning crowd shuffles to their feet, a mix of irritated citizens clutching crumpled parking tickets, sleepy-eyed attorneys in varying degrees of designer suits, and the courthouse regulars who seem to treat these sessions as their personal entertainment. Barrett settles into his high-backed leather chair, adjusting it with the same precise quarter turn he's done every morning since 2009. His arthritis is acting up today, making him even less patient than usual. The morning docket looks particularly heavy. 37 cases, mostly parking violations and minor traffic infractions. He suppresses a sigh, remembering when he dreamed of presiding over dramatic criminal cases and constitutional challenges. Instead, here he is, Nashville's self-proclaimed parking ticket czar. First case, he announces, his voice carrying that particular tone of judicial boredom that only years on the bench can perfect. The regulars in the gallery exchange knowing glances. They've started a betting pool on how many times the judge will roll his eyes during today's session. Someone has already put $20 on at least 15 times before lunch. As the first defendant approaches, a college student with purple hair and an attitude that practically screams, "This is unfair," Barrett notices his clerk, Jenny, struggling with an overflowing stack of files. One folder slips, scattering papers across the floor like confetti. The courthouse regulars lean forward in their seats, anticipating one of Barrett's infamous temper flares. But today, Barrett simply watches, his mind drifting to his upcoming golf game at the country club. He's been trying to break 90 for months now, and today's tea time with the police commissioner might be his chance. The purple-haired student is saying something about broken meters and student loans, but Barrett's already reaching for his gavel. "Miss," he interrupts, using what the court staff has dubbed his meter maid's best friend voice. The city of Nashville doesn't accept the meter was broken as a valid defense, especially when 3 parking enforcement officers testify that it was functioning perfectly. That'll be $75 plus court costs. The gallery regulars share impressed looks, some making subtle tally marks on their notepads. That eye roll was at least an 8.5 on their unofficial scale. As the morning progresses, Barrett falls into his familiar rhythm. Listen for 30 seconds, make a sarcastic comment, impose a fine. Next case. It's a dance he's perfected over the years, earning him nicknames ranging from the hanging judge of High Street to maximum fine Barrett. He wears these titles like badges of honor, believing they demonstrate his unwavering commitment to law and order, even in matters as mundane as parking violations. Little does Barrett know that this methodical Monday morning routine is about to be spectacularly disrupted. As he mindlessly shuffles through the case files, he misses Jenny's subtle change in expression as she reads the next name on the docket. He doesn't notice the bailiff straightening his tie or the sudden shift in the courtroom's atmosphere. He's too busy thinking about his golf swing and mentally calculating how many cases he needs to clear before he can reasonably call for a morning recess. "Next case," he announces, not bothering to look up from his papers. Docket number 2024 TR 7425. The gallery grows unusually quiet. But Barrett, absorbed in his own world of judicial efficiency, fails to register the change. He doesn't yet realize that the next case will force him to confront the dangerous intersection of automated justice and personal connection, or that his carefully constructed routine is about to crumble in the most publicly humbling way possible. The bailiff's voice cuts through the silence. "Calling the case of Washington, Regina M." And thus begins the unraveling of Judge Thomas Barrett's perfectly ordered world. Dr. Regina Washington had already saved 2 lives before most people had their morning coffee. The first was an emergency cesarean at 3 a.m., twins with complicated cord entanglement. The second, a 6-year-old boy with acute appendicitis who'd been rushed in just as her shift was supposed to end. Now, still wearing her navy blue hospital scrubs beneath a hastily donned charcoal blazer, she stands in the back of courtroom 302, scrolling through post-operative notes on her tablet. Her normally pristine appearance shows subtle signs of the chaotic morning. A few strands of silver-streaked hair have escaped her usually immaculate bun, and there's a barely noticeable coffee stain on her blazer's sleeve from when she'd been jerked awake by her attorney's text. Court appearance cannot be rescheduled. Judge Barrett is particularly strict about traffic court attendance. The irony isn't lost on her. Just 3 months ago, she'd hosted an elegant fundraising dinner for Barrett's re-election campaign in her Belmead mansion. The judge had been charming then, passionately discussing his plans for judicial reform and more equitable justice. He'd seemed particularly moved by her speech about the intersection of medical and judicial ethics, even quoting it in his campaign materials. Like medicine, justice requires both precision and humanity. Her phone buzzes again, the 4th time in 10 minutes. Dr. Washington glances at the screen. Another text from the hospital. Patient from or 3 developing post-op complications. Need consult. She quickly types back. Starting antibiotics. Will check vitals remotely. Court appearance. Back in tours. 20 years of pediatric surgery have taught her to handle multiple crises simultaneously, but today is testing even her well-honed multitasking abilities. The gallery's wooden bench creaks as she shifts her weight, drawing a disapproving glance from the elderly woman beside her. Dr. Washington offers an apologetic smile, the same one she uses to reassure anxious parents before surgery. Her mind drifts to the reason she's here, a parking ticket received while performing emergency surgery on the mayor's grandson. The parking garage had been full, and the ambulance bay was her only option. Even the responding paramedics had vouched for her, but the parking enforcement officer had been adamant. Another buzz. This time it's from the Judicial Fundraising Committee. Reminder. Next week's meeting agenda. Discussing Youth Rehabilitation Program funding. Chairwoman Dr. Washington to present main proposal. She almost laughs at the situation's absurdity. In less than an hour, she needs to be back in surgery, and here she sits, waiting to justify a parking violation to a judge whose campaign she'd helped shape. The young clerk organizing files at the front of the courtroom keeps stealing glances at her. Dr. Washington recognizes her. Jenny Thompson. 6 months ago, she performed emergency surgery on Jenny's daughter after a car accident. The girl had made a full recovery, and Jenny had sworn eternal gratitude. Now, she looks torn between professional duty and personal loyalty. A commotion near the door draws her attention. A breathless resident from her hospital unit has appeared, clutching a file folder. Dr. Washington, he whispers urgently, navigating through the crowded gallery. The Johnson twins post-op results. She takes the folder, scanning the contents while simultaneously responding to another emergency consult on her phone. The resident hovers anxiously, but she waves him away with practiced authority. Standard recovery pattern. Continue monitoring. I'll be back for afternoon rounds. As she reviews the twins' charts, her tablet chimes with an incoming video call from the hospital's ICU. She steps into the hallway, keeping one ear tuned to the courtroom proceedings. On the screen, a nervous intern shows her a patient's vital signs, seeking guidance on medication adjustments. Dr. Washington provides precise instructions, her voice carrying the calm confidence that's made her one of the most respected pediatric surgeons in the Southeast. Returning to her seat, she hears the bailiff calling the case before hers. Her own surgery schedule looms. A delicate procedure on a 4-year-old's heart can't wait much longer. The irony deepens. The very qualities that make her an asset to Barrett's campaign, dedication, precision, unwavering commitment to duty, have landed her in his courtroom. Next case. Washington, Regina M. Taking a deep breath, Dr. Washington rises, straightening her blazer. She's handled life-or-death situations in the operating room. Surely, she can handle a simple traffic court appearance. Yet something tells her this morning is about to become more memorable than any routine parking violation should be. "Let's make this quick," Judge Barrett mutters under his breath, glancing at his Rolex. His golf tee time looms closer, and the stack of cases doesn't seem to be getting any smaller. His morning coffee sits cold and forgotten beside him, much like his campaign promises about treating every case with fresh eyes and complete attention. Case number 2024-TR7425, parking violation in an emergency vehicle zone. He announces, his voice carrying the same monotonous tone he's used for the past 3 hours. The morning's tedium has left him operating on autopilot, his mind already visualizing the pristine greens of the Belmead Country Club, rather than focusing on the figure approaching his bench. Dr. Washington moves forward with the same measured grace she uses in the operating room. A few heads in the gallery turn to watch her, some recognizing the surgeon who'd saved their children, others noting the striking contrast between her professional demeanor and the judge's apparent disinterest. Barrett, however, continues shuffling through his papers, not bothering to look up. "Your Honor," Dr. Washington begins, her voice clear and steady, "regarding the parking violation on April 15th. "Let me stop you right there," Barrett interrupts, still focused on his papers. "Emergency vehicle zones are not suggestions, Ms. Washington. They exist for a reason." He emphasizes "Ms." with the slightly condescending tone he reserves for traffic offenders, completely missing the doctor printed clearly on the citation. The young clerk, Jenny, shifts uncomfortably at her desk, her eyes darting between the judge and the woman who'd saved her daughter's life. She starts to raise her hand, then thinks better of it, her face reflecting the growing tension in the courtroom. "Your Honor, if I may explain." Dr. Washington tries again. "I'm a pediatric surgeon at Metropolitan Children's Hospital. That morning, we had an emergency." Barrett waves his hand dismissively, finally looking up but seeing through her rather than at her. "Everyone has emergencies, Ms. Washington. Everyone has somewhere important to be. Do you know how many people come through this court claiming special circumstances?" The irony of his words hangs heavy in the air. Just 3 months ago, at her third fundraising event for his campaign, he praised her dedication to emergency care, calling her one of Nashville's greatest heroes. Now, he's lecturing her about emergencies without a flicker of recognition. "The citation notes you were parked in the ambulance bay for over 4 hours," he continues, his voice rising with practiced indignation. 4 hours. That's not an emergency. That's a blatant disregard for public safety protocols. He launches into his familiar speech about civic responsibility, the same one he practiced at her dinner party, while sipping the expensive bourbon she'd specifically ordered for the event. A few of the regular court watchers exchange knowing looks. They've seen Barrett's lectures before, but this one seems particularly tone-deaf. One elderly gentleman in the back, whose grandson Dr. Washington had operated on last summer, shakes his head in disbelief. The judge continues his monologue, warming to his subject. "Perhaps if more people understood the importance of emergency vehicle access, do you know how many lives could be at risk because someone decides their errand is more important than public safety?" The irony of questioning the surgeon about saving lives is lost on him as he builds toward his customary crescendo. Dr. Washington stands perfectly still, her expression neutral but her eyes reflecting a mix of disbelief and professional composure. The same hands that had delicately repaired a 4-year-old's heart that morning now gripped the edge of the defendant's table, her knuckles whitening slightly, the only visible sign of her growing frustration. Just as Barrett reaches for his gavel, preparing to deliver what he considers a suitably stern fine, Jenny finally finds her courage. Her hands trembling slightly, she scribbles a note and hurries toward the bench. The click of her heels against the courtroom floor seems to echo in the tense silence. "Your Honor," she whispers urgently, sliding the note in front of him. "You might want to read this before continuing." Barrett, irritated at the interruption of his well-practiced routine, glances down at the note. His expression begins to change as the words register, his face slowly draining of color as realization dawns. The next few moments would become legendary in Nashville's legal community. The courtroom falls into a silence so complete you could hear a law book's pages rustle. Judge Barrett's face has achieved a shade of red previously unseen in Tennessee's judicial system, somewhere between overripe tomato and medical emergency. The note in his hands trembles slightly, causing the paper to produce a soft, crinkling sound that seems to echo off the high courtroom ceiling. $500, he manages to croak out, his voice catching slightly. It's his go-to-fine amount when he's rattled, though he's never been quite this rattled before. The gallery collectively inhales. It's his harshest fine of the morning. And the irony of imposing it on his own campaign's medical committee chair isn't lost on anyone except, apparently, him. The bailiff, Officer James Wilson, shifts uncomfortably near the bench. Just last month, Dr. Washington had performed emergency surgery on his nephew after a catastrophic Little League accident. He'd sat with his sister in the waiting room for 6 hours while the doctor worked her magic. Now, he watches her face as she absorbs the fine amount, her expression remaining professionally neutral despite the clear injustice unfolding. In the gallery, the courthouse regulars are having a field day. Mrs. Peterson, who hasn't missed a traffic court session in 12 years, frantically scribbles in her beloved courthouse diary. This will definitely be the highlight of next week's Bridge Club gossip. Beside her, retired attorney Dan Matthews shakes his head slowly. He'd been at all 3 of Dr. Washington's fundraising events for Barrett's campaign, and the judge's obliviousness is almost painful to watch. Dr. Washington reaches for her phone, likely to access her banking app, but her movement is interrupted by another incoming hospital alert. The screen shows urgent messages from 3 different departments: pediatric ICU, emergency, and surgery. Her presence is needed in all 3 places, yet here she stands, being fined by a judge who'd once called her the backbone of our community's healthcare system in his campaign speech. Jenny, the clerk, has begun stress organizing her desk papers with shaking hands. She's mentally calculating how many children's lives Dr. Washington could save with the $500 she's about to pay in fines. The last fundraiser at the doctor's house had raised over $50,000 for Barrett's campaign, more than enough to justify at least a moment of recognition from the bench. Near the back of the courtroom, 2 young lawyers from the district attorney's office whisper furiously behind their legal pads. One of them had clerked for Barrett last year and remembers typing up the judge's glowing thank you speech after Dr. Washington's 3rd campaign event. The other is already composing a text to their office's gossip group chat. This story is too good not to share. The tension builds as Dr. Washington calmly opens her banking app. The soft electronic chirp of the transaction processing seems to snap something in Officer Wilson. He steps forward, clearing his throat. "Your Honor, if I may." But Barrett, still operating on autopilot, despite his obvious discomfort, waves him off. A young mother in the gallery clutches her sleeping toddler closer to her chest. Just last week, this same doctor had stayed 4 hours past her shift to save the child's best friend after a severe asthma attack. The mother's eyes dart between the doctor and the judge, silently willing him to recognize the woman standing before him. The courtroom clock ticks loudly in the thick silence, each second marking another moment of judicial obliviousness. Dr. Washington's phone buzzes again. The hospital needs her for an emergency consultation. She glances at the message while maintaining her composed stance, a skill perfected through years of handling multiple crises simultaneously. Just as she's about to complete the fine payment, Jenny makes her move. Unable to bear the injustice any longer, she grabs another piece of paper and begins writing frantically. This note will be longer, more detailed, impossible to ignore. She's determined to break through Barrett's thick fog of routine and remind him exactly who he's finding. As Jenny rises from her desk, paper in hand, the gallery holds its collective breath. They're about to witness either the most awkward moment in Nashville's judicial history or the most spectacular recovery of judicial awareness ever recorded in Tennessee. Either way, not a single person can look away from what's about to unfold. The clock strikes 11, and Jenny begins her determined walk toward the bench. The note Jenny delivers is written in red ink, underlined twice, with 3 exclamation points decorating its final sentence. As Judge Barrett's eyes scan the hastily scrawled message, his face performs an Olympic-worthy routine of emotional gymnastics, transitioning from irritation to confusion, then recognition, and finally landing squarely on mortification. Dr. Regina Washington, campaign medical chair, hosted 3 fundraisers, saved my daughter's life last year. The words seemed to dance mockingly before his eyes. His hand, still gripping his favorite gavel, a birthday gift from his wife, begins to tremble slightly. The courtroom temperature feels like it's risen 10 degrees, though the ancient air conditioning system wheezes on unchanged. Barrett's mind races through a highlight reel of memories, each one landing like a punch to his judicial ego. The elegant fundraising dinner where Dr. Washington had charmed his biggest donors. The emergency surgery she performed on the police chief's daughter during his campaign launch. The impassioned speech she'd given about judicial fairness that he quoted in every campaign appearance afterward. The same Dr. Washington who now stands before him, composed and dignified, despite having just been lectured about emergency vehicles by a man who wouldn't know a scalpel from a letter opener. In the gallery, phones have emerged like periscopes, their owners pretending to check messages while actually documenting what promises to be the most talked-about traffic court session in Nashville history. Mrs. Peterson, the court regular, has already composed 3 different versions of how she'll describe this moment at tomorrow's Garden Club meeting. Dr. Washington's phone buzzes again. The video call request from the ICU. She glances at Judge Barrett, silently asking permission to step aside. He nods automatically, still staring at Jenny's note, as if it might spontaneously combust and save him from this situation. The doctor's quiet conversation about post-operative care drifts across the courtroom, providing an ironic soundtrack to the judge's internal crisis. Blood pressure stabilizing. Yes, adjust the medication. I'll be there as soon as court concludes. Each medical term she utters makes Barrett sink a little lower in his chair. He's suddenly very aware of his morning routine of dispensing justice without looking up, of treating each case like an item to be checked off his list, rather than a human situation requiring his full attention. Jenny hovers nervously near the bench, armed with a second note in case the first one hasn't fully registered. This one contains a photograph from Barrett's campaign website. Dr. Washington standing beside him at the hospital fundraiser, both smiling as she presents him with a check that could have covered several hundred parking tickets. The bailiff, Officer Wilson, has positioned himself strategically near the judge's water pitcher, ready to assist if Barrett's increasingly apparent distress requires hydration. His nephew's surgery scar seems to throb in sympathy with the judge's embarrassment. Dr. Washington concludes her medical consult and returns her attention to the court, her expression still maintaining that perfect balance of professional dignity and patience that serves her so well in both operating room and fundraising galas. She waits, hands clasped loosely before her, as Barrett grapples with his monumental faux pas. The silence stretches until it becomes almost tangible. Even the usual courthouse background noise, shuffling papers, whispered conversations, the distant ding of elevator doors, seems to have paused in anticipation of what happens next. Finally, Barrett clears his throat. The sound echoes through the courtroom like a starting gun. Every head snaps to attention. Every eye fixes on the bench. Mrs. Peterson grips her notebook so tightly her knuckles whiten. The young lawyers in the back row lean forward in perfect unison. Dr. Washington, he begins, his voice carrying a note of humility never before heard in room 302. The emphasis he places on doctor seems to hang in the air, a verbal apology for his earlier dismissive Ms. But before he can continue, Dr. Washington's phone erupts again. This time, it's not a subtle buzz but an urgent ring, her emergency surgery tone. The judge's carefully prepared words of contrition collide with the reality of what Dr. Washington actually does when she's not hosting fundraisers or appearing in his court. The next few moments would demonstrate whether Judge Thomas Barrett could rise to the occasion and transform an embarrassing mistake into a moment of genuine judicial wisdom. The moments that follow feel like a slow-motion scene in a courtroom drama. Judge Barrett's memories cascade through his mind like a slideshow of his own obliviousness. Dr. Washington's passionate speech at his campaign launch, her elegant hosting of 3 fundraising dinners, the way she'd rallied the entire medical community to support his re-election. Each memory lands like a blow to his judicial dignity. Your Honor, Dr. Washington answers her phone with one hand while addressing the court with practiced multitasking ability. I have an emergency situation at Metropolitan Children's. A 7-year-old requires immediate surgery. Her voice carries the same calm authority she'd used when introducing him to potential donors, though now it's focused on saving a life rather than his political career. The galley watches as Barrett's face transitions through various shades of mortification. His earlier pompous lecture about emergency vehicles now echoes in his head with crushing irony. The sane woman he'd just fined for parking in an ambulance bay is about to rush off to perform life-saving surgery. Again. The parking ticket in question, Jenny pipes up, her voice trembling but determined, was issued during the emergency surgery on Mayor Thompson's grandson. She places another note on Barrett's bench, this one containing the complete timeline. Dr. Washington's car was in the ambulance bay because she ran directly from her car to the operating room. The surgery lasted 4 hours and 17 minutes. The mayor's office actually tried to intervene with the ticket, but Dr. Washington insisted on following proper legal channels. Barrett stares at the note, remembering how he'd bragged at his country club about his connection to the mayor's grandson's miraculous surgery. He'd even used it in a campaign speech, praising the dedication of Nashville's medical professionals. The same dedication he'd just dismissed as a mere excuse for a parking violation. The judge's prized gavel, an antique piece he'd often boasted about, seems to mock him from its polished stand. He'd been using it all morning to punctuate his self-righteous pronouncements, each bang a period at the end of another rushed judgment. In the gallery, Mrs. Peterson has finally stopped writing in her courthouse diary, too engrossed in the unfolding drama. The young lawyers in the back have abandoned any pretense of professional detachment, their expressions a mix of schadenfreude and genuine fascination. Officer Wilson keeps glancing at his nephew's photo in his wallet, remembering the night Dr. Washington had spent 6 hours in surgery saving the boy's life. Dr. Washington's phone buzzes again. The OR team is waiting. The clock on the courtroom wall seems to tick louder, marking the precious minutes sliding by. Every second Barrett spends wallowing in his embarrassment is another second delayed for a child needing surgery. I believe, Barrett finally speaks, his voice catching slightly, that we need to revisit this matter. He shuffles through his papers, buying time, desperately searching for words that could adequately address his colossal oversight. The same judicial eloquence he'd displayed at fundraising events seems to have abandoned him entirely. Dr. Washington, your dedicated service to this community. He begins, then stops. The carefully crafted campaign speeches about justice and community service stick in his throat. How hollow they must sound now, coming from someone who just demonstrated such spectacular failure to practice what he preached. The doctor's phone chirps again. Another message from the OR. Barrett watches as she efficiently types a response while maintaining her poised stance before his bench. It's the same professional multitasking he'd praised in his campaign speeches, now performing live in his courtroom. Your Honor, Dr. Washington interjects gently but firmly, her years of handling high-pressure situations evident in her measured tone. While I appreciate your reconsideration, there's a child waiting for surgery. Perhaps we could. Barrett's gavel hand twitches involuntarily. For the first time in his 15 years on the bench, he's completely lost control of his courtroom, not through any disruption or defiance, but through the quiet dignity of a woman who's managed to make him question every judgment he's made that morning. The next words out of his mouth would either salvage or completely destroy his carefully cultivated image of judicial wisdom. The entire courtroom holds its breath, waiting to see how Nashville's most notorious traffic court judge will handle the most awkward moment of his career. Dr. Washington. Barrett begins, rising from his chair in an unprecedented break from judicial protocol. The court finds itself in need of correction. His voice, usually so certain, wavers slightly as he removes his reading glasses. For the first time all morning, he's actually looking at someone before him, really seeing them. The gallery rustles with anticipation. Mrs. Peterson's pen hovers above her notebook, ready to record what promises to be the most memorable moment in her 12 years of courtroom observation. The two young lawyers in the back have completely abandoned their pretense of working, their legal pads forgotten in their laps. "Your Honor," Dr. Washington responds, glancing at her phone's increasingly urgent notifications. "I appreciate your—" "Please," Barrett interrupts, but gently this time, nothing like his earlier brusque dismissals. "Allow me to finish. It seems I'd forgotten something crucial today. Something you actually reminded me of during my campaign." He pauses, swallowing hard. "You said that justice, like medicine, requires both precision and humanity. I quoted those words dozens of times during my campaign, but today I failed to practice them." The bailiff, Officer Wilson, straightens his tie and tries to hide his smile. His nephew's successful surgery scar suddenly feels like a badge of honor. Jenny, the clerk, has tears forming in her eyes, though she quickly wipes them away with her sleeve. "This morning," Barrett continues, his voice gaining strength not from authority, but from humility, "I've been practicing automated justice, processing cases like a machine, seeing violations instead of people." He picks up Jenny's notes, holding them like evidence in a capital case. "Dr. Washington, while you were saving the mayor's grandson, I was probably practicing my golf swing. While you were hosting fundraisers for judicial reform, I was becoming exactly the kind of judge we promised to reform." A soft murmur ripples through the courtroom. No one can remember Barrett ever admitting to a mistake, let alone delivering what amounts to a public apology. The court reporter's fingers fly across her stenotype, determined not to miss a word of this historic moment. Dr. Washington's phone buzzes again, more insistently. The OR team is waiting, a child's life hanging in the balance. But Barrett isn't finished. He needs to say this, needs to transform this embarrassing moment into something meaningful. "The fine is dismissed," he declares, but then adds quickly, "not because of who you are or what you've done for my campaign, but because I failed to give your case the attention it deserved. I failed to look up, to listen, to consider the human element that every case, no matter how routine, deserves." He reaches for his gavel, then stops, looking at it as if seeing it for the first time. This court stands adjourned for 15 minutes. When we resume, every case will receive the full attention it deserves. His eyes sweep the gallery, including everyone in his proclamation. No more automated justice. Dr. Washington offers a small, appreciative nod, already turning toward the door. But Barrett has one final thing to say. "Doctor," he calls after her, his voice carrying a note of genuine respect that's been absent all morning. "Thank you. Not for your campaign support, but for teaching me a lesson I should have learned long ago. Now go save that child's life." The gallery erupts in scattered applause, quickly silenced by Officer Wilson's stern look, but the sentiment echoes through the courtroom. As Dr. Washington hurries out, her shoes clicking purposefully against the floor, Barrett remains standing, watching her go. The morning stack of cases still sits before him, but now each folder represents not just a violation to be processed, but a story to be heard. Jenny approaches the bench with fresh tissues, offering them to the judge who seems suddenly older, more human behind his imposing desk. "Your Honor," she whispers, "that," Barrett responds, removing his robe, "was justice finally being served in this courtroom, and it took a parking ticket to do it." He glances at his watch. His golf tee time came and went unnoticed, forgotten in the wake of this moment of judicial enlightenment. The next session would begin in 15 minutes, and Judge Thomas Barrett had some serious thinking to do about how to run his courtroom going forward. 1 year later, Courtroom 302 has undergone a transformation as remarkable as its presiding judge. Judge Thomas Barrett's infamous morning traffic court sessions now start 15 minutes later than they used to, time he spends reviewing each case file personally, determined never to repeat his mistake with Dr. Washington. The Barrett eye roll counter, maintained by courthouse regulars, has been retired, replaced by what Mrs. Peterson now calls the Barrett Humanity Index. Today's session begins like all others in the past year, with the judge looking directly at each person who stands before him, his reading glasses permanently retired to his desk drawer. "You know," he tells a nervous college student facing her first traffic violation, "someone once taught me that justice requires both precision and humanity." He smiles slightly, remembering. The custom coffee mug on his bench catches the morning light, its inscription clearly visible. "Justice is blind, but judges shouldn't be." It was Dr. Washington's gift to him after that fateful day, delivered with the same grace she'd shown in his courtroom. The mug has become something of a legend in Nashville's legal community. Young law clerks whisper the story to each other during lunch breaks, how the city's most notorious hanging judge of traffic court was transformed by a parking ticket and a doctor too busy saving lives to attend her own hearing. The story has even made its way into local law school lectures as a case study in judicial humility and the importance of seeing the human element in every case. Barrett's golf game hasn't improved much. He's still trying to break 90. But his reputation has soared. The local bar association recently honored him with their Judicial Excellence Award, citing his commitment to personalized justice in an age of automation. During his acceptance speech, he credited Dr. Washington, though she couldn't attend. She was in surgery, as usual, saving another life. The judge's transformation extends beyond his courtroom. He now volunteers monthly at Metropolitan Children's Hospital, reading to young patients. It's there that he occasionally crosses paths with Dr. Washington in the hallways. They exchange knowing smiles, their shared moment of judicial enlightenment having evolved into a quiet friendship based on mutual respect. Today's docket includes another doctor with a parking violation. Barrett listens carefully to her explanation about an emergency situation, remembering how he'd failed to do the same a year ago. The fine is still issued. Justice must be served. But the doctor leaves feeling heard and respected, understanding the balance between law and necessity. Jenny, still his faithful clerk, no longer needs to write emergency notes. Barrett's new habit of actually looking at the people before him has prevented any similar incidents, though she keeps a red pen handy, just in case. Some courtroom traditions die hard. The infamous parking ticket itself has been framed and hangs in Barrett's chambers, next to his law degree and judicial appointment. He's added a small plaque beneath it. "The day justice looked up." It serves as a daily reminder that behind every case number is a human story waiting to be heard. As today's session concludes, Barrett notices a familiar face in the gallery. Officer Wilson's nephew, now fully recovered thanks to Dr. Washington's surgical skills. The boy waves, pointing to his barely visible scar. Barrett waves back, remembering how that same scar had silently testified against his hastiness 1 year ago. After court adjourns, Barrett picks up his beloved coffee mug and reads its inscription one more time. His afternoon calendar shows a judicial committee meeting where they'll discuss expanding the court's community outreach programs. Dr. Washington's proposal for a medical legal partnership program is on the agenda, though she'll call in from the OR between surgeries. As he gathers his papers, Barrett reflects on how a simple parking ticket changed not just his courtroom, but his entire approach to justice. His golf clubs gather dust in his office corner, replaced by community service schedules and hospital volunteer rosters. Justice looked up, he murmurs to himself, straightening his bow tie in the chamber's mirror. The man looking back at him is older and perhaps a bit humbler, but definitely wiser. In the end, it wasn't his campaign promises that changed his courtroom. It was a parking ticket, a dedicated doctor, and the courage to admit he needed to change. The legend of the parking ticket that transformed Nashville's toughest traffic court judge lives on. A reminder that sometimes the greatest lessons in justice come from unexpected places.